Hey moms, it's Laura Ollinger. Welcome to the Positively Healthy Mom podcast. Because there's no manual for the hardest job in the world. Welcome. Today we have our wonderful guest, a friend of mine, Parra, a transformational coach, certified elite neuroencoding specialist, licensed brain health trainer, certified behavioral consultant, and certified grief educator. So welcome, Diana. Thank you for coming today.
Oh, thank you for having me, Laura. I'm excited to be here.
Yes. And I should mention that Diana is also the founder and CEO of Parra International and author of Leading with a Broken Heart, Finding Gold in Our Darkest Moments. So that title kind of speaks for itself as far as the topic that we're leading off today, which is primarily about grief and loss of a child after a miscarriage, and we'll see where the conversation goes from there. So, Diana, can you share a little bit about your background and what led you to become a transformational coach and grief educator?
Sure. So I actually started out my career in mental health. I was a therapist, a master's level therapist. And what led me into the grief education world and coaching, especially coaching women who have experienced some type of loss, is, my own experience of loss. I've experienced 4 miscarriages. I've also experienced loss of health. I was diagnosed with breast cancer at one point, and then that same week, a couple of days later, I was diagnosed with rheumatoid arthritis.
Wow.
So it's kind of like multiple losses in different areas of my life.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So then I was already coaching, and when I had experience of the health challenge, I realized how many of us, especially women, have gone through some type of loss, and we don't really take the time to grieve. I mean, we can grieve the loss of our health, not just the loss of a loved one. And all these little losses or big losses can kind of stack and add up. And it really takes a toll on our identity.
Yeah. That's something that you don't normally connect, I guess, the dots on. And I'm sure that's part of your process that you go through with your clients. So what are some common misconceptions about grief, and what do you do to help dispel them in your coaching with your clients?
Yeah. So I think one of them is, my mentor, he always says, we live in a grief illiterate world, right? Which is why he created this program to certify people as grief educators, so that we can go out there and educate people going through grief, to normalize it, to let them know that whatever they're experiencing, whatever they're feeling, it's normal. It's okay. So one of the misconceptions, is like, how long do you grieve for? Like, how long does the process take? How long is too short or too long, right? And really, there is no too long or too short of a period of time to grieve. It's very personal. It's a personal experience. And it depends on the loss. It depends on how that individual experiences that loss, right? And so a lot of times you see people saying, you'll hear like, well, it's been a year since, your husband passed away. You kind of should be like moving on now, That person may not be ready to move on. They're still grieving. They're still going through that process.
So I guess that would be the question is, at what point are they stuck? If they are in this grief process and it's lasting a significant amount of time, at what point do they need help to then move forward?
Yeah, that's a great question, and what I look at is the grief, right? Are they moving? First of all, are they moving through the grieving process? Doesn't matter how long, are they moving along? We know when they're stuck, when they're kind of like, they're not moving, and it's starting to really have a negative impact on their life, on their day-to-day, and they can't really move out of that into like, okay, I'm let's say I'm going back to work, and yes, I'm still grieving, but I can go and I can go to work and I can do my job and I can come home and I can cook myself a meal and I can take care of, maybe I need to rest more than I typically, need to rest, but we're still kind of engaging in life.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So some signs that maybe people should look for, not just in themselves, but maybe their loved ones. If there's a mom on here that's watching or listening and they know of someone who's going through grief, maybe, so the things that you're kind of highlighting are they going through the stages of grief? And I know that that's not a linear process, that it's kind of, all over the map, and maybe you could speak to that, but then also, how much is that affecting them being able to still, there's probably a period of time where they are just going to be shut down and not engaging in life. But then I think what you're saying, and to correct me if I'm wrong, is that maybe slowly over time, they could be able to re-engage and just operate in a functional sense in their life, whether it's being able to go to the grocery store, finally being able to cook a meal, or being able to have a conversation, or speaking with a friend, or going back to work. And I know from my personal experience on grief, which I'll get to more later, that those kind of functional things can be incredibly difficult, and they should not be taken for granted or taken lightly as that being a challenge. So going back to the first part of my question is, going through that kind of loopy process, what does that look like when you are coaching a client?
So it really depends. What I like to do is kind of assess where they are in that process. And you're right. And I'm happy that you mentioned that. It's not a linear process, right? The stages of grief, we kind of go back and forth, and, we jump from one to the next. And that's just the process. We can go from denial to depression to bargaining to acceptance to, and then acceptance, and then go back to, denial, right? Because it's a process. I mean, you've probably experienced the loss of, let's say, a loved one. They're no longer in your life. And so it takes a long, long time to kind of, integrate that loss and be at the point where you can say, okay, my life can go on. I miss the person. I can love them. They're still with me. They're still part of me, but my life can go on now. So it's kind of like, I like to, make that assessment first. I kind of get a picture of where they are. And it also depends on when the loss happened, when that occurred. Usually, I wouldn't say that someone is stuck if they're still like in the first 2 years.
Yeah. Okay.
Process,
Yeah.
So that's kind of like where I start to look at, okay, if it's been longer and, longer than 2 years, and now they're looking for coaching because they feel like, there's something here that's kind of, not allowing me to move forward, then that's where, we take it from there.
Yeah. I'm sure there are probably some extreme cases that you've seen. I don't know what that would look like, but for all I know, there's people out there who have been grieving for 20 years, right? And they haven't ever been able to really get out of that. I can't speak to that because this is not the topic that I typically work with. So what is that like? What is like an extreme amount of time, do you think?
I haven't had extreme cases like that, but that can happen. And one of the reasons is, with grief, is that grief needs to be witnessed for us to kind of go through that process and heal. And a lot of times, because, we shy away as a society, we shy away from death, the topic of death, the topic of loss, the topic of grief. So most people don't feel like they can talk about it openly. And when they start to share, oftentimes a lot of people are like, oh, okay. And then they want to end that conversation as quickly as they can because it makes them uncomfortable. They don't know what to do. They don't know what to say. And so they want to just end the conversation. And what ends up happening is the person that's grieving feels like, oh, I can't talk about this. And that starts to create also, they may be dealing with feelings of guilt and shame. And if they can't talk about that with someone, those feelings are just going to amplify. So So I think that's why it's so important. And I'm very passionate about, like educating people about, and myself about that, that whole process, and educating my clients, because I know when I went through the miscarriages for a long time, I mean, it took me years before I actually could talk about, what I went through. Mm-hmm. When I went through the first miscarriage, I told just probably like 3 people. Obviously my husband knew, and my immediate family, my parents and my sister and my best friend. And that was it. I did not share that with anyone else. And then when I had the other 3 miscarriages, again, pretty much the same people. Mm-hmm. And that just because I had a lot of guilt and a lot of shame, right? I felt like maybe I did something wrong. Maybe I caused the miscarriages, or maybe, the shame of like not being able to carry, the baby. Maybe there's something wrong with me. Maybe there's something wrong with my body. And so not being able to share that just amplified those feelings, because again, my grief wasn't really witnessed. I mean, that was my own doing. I'm not, putting it on anyone else. And then also people don't know what to do. I mean, when I had the first miscarriage, obviously I was very, very upset. And when I told my parents, they didn't know what to say. And what they did was they said to me, "Oh, honey, don't cry." Right. And I understand that was they didn't want to see me in pain. Right. Like, it's going to be okay. But in that moment, I'm like, it's not okay. So it's kind of like, again, educating people that, even little things like that. And they were well-intentioned, they weren't trying to hurt me. But we have to do a better job of really educating ourselves on how to be with someone in grief and how to respond to, to their situation.
Mm-hmm. So what stands out to me about that is, yes, everybody probably has the best intentions, and it's very challenging, I think, for the average person to kind of sit in discomfort, because it is a very uncomfortable feeling. And so they want to get out of that as quickly as possible. And it's really a challenge to just be with someone in their pain. And what comes to mind for me is just kind of being there, validating the feelings, not trying to change the feelings, not trying to change the situation, not trying to like look on the bright side, it'll get better, or, oh, don't forget to be grateful for what you do have, right? Everybody's trying to do this whole cheer up process. So how could you like educate or advise our audience on how to be with someone who is grieving?
Yeah. And, the best thing that you can do is really sit with them, be with them, like physically be with them. If they're comfortable with that, you don't have to say anything. You don't have to try to fix it. You don't have to try to cheer them up. You can simply say, "I'm here for you. And I'll sit here with you and just be with you for as long as you allow me to be here." And that's it. If they start, a lot of times what happens is they'll start to open up. They'll start to share. Maybe they'll start to talk about memories of their loved one, or maybe they'll talk about how they're feeling. And the best thing that you can do is just, like you said, just listen to them, just hear them, just hold that space for them, and not try to do anything, not try to fix it, because this is all normal. And that's what we have to, that we need to change that. Like, we want to fix it because the implication being that there's something wrong. It's a problem. And it's not. It's just the process of, of grieving. So just be with them, sit with them. You can ask, what can I do right now? Can I cook you a meal? Can I go, get you something that you need? But I'm here for you. That's the most important thing, is for them to know that you're there for them. And that's it. It's just as, simple as that, yet it's not that simple to do. It's not easy to do.
Yeah. And then my next question relates to something me personally. So today is actually the birthday, or what would have been the birthday, of my nephew who took his own life. And I sent a simple text to my sister, and I said, thinking of Adam today, happy birthday to him. And so what do you say to people around? I know you had a big kind of campaign or social media thing going on before the holidays about how to be with grief during the holidays. But what I'm thinking of is the anniversary or special dates, birthdays, things like that. Like, what is it that's so significant or important about those dates that's like activating that extra grief during those times?
Yeah. Well, first of all, Laura, I want to say, I'm sorry for your loss. I want to acknowledge that. And, the thing with anniversaries and certain dates is they just, of course, they bring up the memory of the person, the person that we've lost. And we start to automatically remember, So for example, we just went through the holidays. So Christmas, you might start remembering like, oh, I remember, 3 Christmases ago, when the person was here and we did X, Y, and Z, right? And of course, those memories are attached to emotion. And so it starts to bring up, a lot of the yearning for what was, and no longer is. So again, it's a lot of, during those times, the grief comes up again, and you start thinking about, okay, I miss this person. They're not here. I wish they were here. If they were here, we would be doing this. Maybe it would be a different experience. Maybe I wouldn't feel the way I feel right now. And so it's important to acknowledge that it's okay when, certain dates, anniversaries come up, that those feelings might come up as well, and it's just, again, allow that to happen, process those feelings, process the fact that they're no longer with you. And instead, like, what can you do to, to remember them, to bring more of the love, to step more into like the love and out of the pain. So that's what I do in my coaching, is to help my clients move away from the pain and more into like the love. So remember them, not with pain, but remember them with love. So you can, go back to those memories and think, oh yeah, I remember when this happened, and oh, that was so funny when they did this and that they did that, and then just hold on to that, the love, right? That's what matters. Instead of like remembering them like, oh my gosh, I wish they were here and I'm so sad, and we want to move away from the pain and more into the love.
Okay, that's great. That's really good advice for people to just think of and remember and be aware of for their loved ones who, during those special memories or special holidays, anniversaries and everything like that, that's kind of part of the process, is just that it's activating a memory, it's activating a feeling, and just try to be with them and kind of, I don't know how you could steer, but that's what kind of your job is, to away from the pain and into the love, but maybe people can find a way to, make that happen. So I'm just really curious how, you share as much as you'd like to, but how did you personally heal or recover from your grief? Because, they always say losing a child is the most painful loss that anyone can suffer. And so, 4 of them, that's a lot of loss, and you're doing amazing and you're awesome. And you now have 3 amazing kids. And, you obviously did get through the other side of that. So what was that process like for you?
For me, it was a very, very long process. And like I mentioned before, because I didn't really, I didn't allow myself to grieve, first of all. I wanted to move on as quickly as possible. I wanted to I went from, the loss back into my life. And I was just about doing things. Of course, that was a way of distracting myself from the pain. And I'm okay. Didn't talk about it, or very little with my husband. And just it's time to move on, just go to the next thing, work, life, whatever it is. But deep down inside, I had an enormous amount of pain. And what ended up happening for me is I do think that part of that contributed to me getting sick eventually. Just my body could not hold, all of that pain. And of course, after the second and the third and the fourth, I would just do the same thing, and not allowing myself to feel the way that, my emotions, my feelings, my pain, my grief, it just really took a toll on me. And I ended up feeling super tired. Like I said, I got sick. I ended up with with rheumatoid arthritis, which is an autoimmune, disease. And I was miserable. My husband and I adopted our 3 kids. I'm going to say like it was a couple years after after the 3rd miscarriage, because the last one I had while I had already had my kids. And it had such a negative, impact on my entire life. I could not really, I wanted to be, a great mom. I wanted to be there for my kids. And of course, my kids, they were 3, 5, and 7 when we adopted them. So they had their own trauma that they were going through. And it just became like a really bad situation for everyone, because I was stuck in my grief, at that point. And because I wasn't grieving, so I was literally like stuck, and I was trying to be a good mom, and I really could not be there for my kids. And I couldn't hold space for their trauma. And I was miserable. And it got so bad that at one point I didn't want to live anymore. I was in so much pain that I wanted out. And it wasn't until it was actually when that happened, when I found myself sitting on my bed holding a bottle of pills, and I made a phone call. I decided that I needed help. And I went into bereavement counseling. And that's really kind of what started the whole process of me healing, and allowing myself to grieve and learning that it was okay for me to feel the way that I felt, and that it was okay for me to sometimes just not want to do anything, and that the guilt and the shame were part of the grief. And that was okay too. So I started to understand that was all those emotions, all those feelings were normal, and that all I needed to do, or what I needed to do, was to allow myself to go through that process. And, it was very challenging because of my situation, because my kids also needed a lot of help, not just from me, but professional help. So there were a lot of layers, at that point. But just little by little, I was able to kind of move through that. And really, I had to prioritize myself and my well-being and my healing, because that was the only way for me to then be the best mom that I could be for my kids.
Totally. Yeah. So I can relate in a very different context, but I have had my own personal grief where I, many years ago, went through a very slow and painful loss of a marriage. So I ended up having to get divorced. But at the time, I was still fighting for the marriage. I was still working on the marriage. And I was kind of in a state of trauma. And I was not able to be there for my kids in the way that I wanted to be. And I specifically remember my daughter, who was in 5th grade, knocking on my bathroom door. I had kind of like locked myself in the bathroom, and she needed help with her math homework. And I just said, honey, I can't help you right now. I can't help you. I just kept saying it over and over again, because she was like, Mom, please, I need help. And it's like the worst feeling ever, to feel so helpless as a mom and just as a human. Like I literally couldn't do it. I couldn't open that door and focus. I was just like in a completely dysregulated state. And so, it took me some time to process the guilt that I had about that, and the shame that I had about that, because I pride myself in being an amazing mom. But I know that there was a period of time where I wasn't. And so I'm kind of almost have had to go through a grief process of myself in that time period, because I wasn't what I wanted. And so that was its own, loss on top of loss that I was already dealing with. Does that like resonate with you? I see a lot of nodding.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And I mean, I absolutely, like, the guilt is just, it's unbearable because you want to be there for your kids, but you just really, you can't. And it's really about understanding and giving ourselves some grace, and understanding that we did the best that we could at that, at that time, in that moment. We couldn't give anymore because we didn't have any more to give, you know?
Yeah.
And I think and I tell my clients that, because I do sometimes hear, similar stories. And I tell them, like, you did the best that you could. And, you now have to celebrate yourself and understand that you are now a completely different person. You moved through that. And so now you have more to give, because you have taken care of yourself. You have invested in your healing. And in a way, I see that as what a beautiful gift to give your children, for them to witness your mom, their mom, taking care of herself and getting herself out of, like, a situation like that, feeling stuck or a very disempowering state, and getting herself out of that. Because by them watching that and witnessing that, they're learning, that they too can do that if they ever need to, instead of watching their mom, like, completely fall apart and just not get out of that situation. I mean, that's a completely different picture.
I'm going to pause my conversation with Diana Parra. If you'd like to hear more, listen to my next episode. Thank you for listening to the Positively Healthy Mom podcast, because there's no manual for the hardest job in the world. Don't forget to subscribe and share with your friends.